ดีทุกท่านอีกครั้งและยินดีต้อนรับเข้าสู่การประชุมมนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลไทย 2024 ณ ศูนย์มนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัล คณะอักษรศาสตร์ จุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัยค่ะ ดิฉันนางสาวธีนิดาทรัพยาสาร นิสิตวิชาเอกเทคโนโลยีภาษาและสารสนเทศ คณะอักษรศาสตร์ จุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัยค่ะ
ครับและกระผมนายณภัสแสงสว่างวัฒนะนิสิตวิชาเอกเทคโนโลยีภาษาและสารสนเทศคณะอักษรศาสตร์จุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัยในวันนี้ก็ได้กลับมาเจอกับพวกเราทั้งสองคนอีกครั้งนะครับครับและสำหรับช่วงนี้นะครับจะเป็นการปาฐกถาในหัวข้อ Developing an Infrastructure for Digital Humanities in the Context of Asia ขอมอบเวทีนี้ให้กับผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร.นยา สุจฉายาผู้ดำเนินรายการครับขอเรียนเชิญครับ
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our keynote session on developing an infrastructure for digital humanities in the context of Asia. Today, we are honored to have our distinguished scholar who is at the forefront of integrating digital humanities with historical studies. Our speaker is Dr. Tsui an associate professor in the Department of Chinese and History at the City University of Hong Kong. Dr. Tsui received his bachelor's degree in history from Peking University and his doctoral degree in Chinese history from University of Oxford. Dr. Tsui specialized in mid-imperial Chinese history and culture, as well as digital humanities. His scholarship includes position at Oxford University as departmental lecturer and at Howard University as a postdoctoral fellow. And he contributed China biographical database project. For the past 4 years, Dr. Tsui has led a digital society research cluster at City University and is now preparing a co-convene a cluster focusing on digital learning and literacy. Dr. Tsui is a fellow of both Royal Historical Society and the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland. He has held visiting appointments and fellowships at many prestigious institutions such as Academia Sinica, Peking University, and University of Western Australia, to name but a few. In today's talk, Dr. Tsui will explore the crucial role of digital approaches in the humanities, focusing on the development of digital humanities infrastructure in Chinese historical studies. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tsui Lik Han.
Thank you so very much for this kind introduction, and also thank you so much for bringing me to this beautiful campus. It's my first time here in Thailand and in Bangkok, so I'm really glad to be sharing with you, and also very nice to see you staying until the very end, almost, of the forum. So I'll do 3 things today, and these all relate to infrastructure in the context of Asia and digital humanities. But first of all, a little bit about myself, because I wanted to explain why this matters to myself and where I'm getting at from. So I am a historian by training, especially focusing on medieval China, 10th to 13th century social history and cultural history. So I gained the Ph.D. in history, really, in Chinese history. But it was during then when I got exposed to text markup and digital humanities methods. And so it really opened a new world for me. And then I joined the China Biographical Database and began working on digital humanities as well. It was during that postdoc when I was tasked with the mission, really, to build capacity in DH research in Asia, especially in the Chinese-speaking world, because the database caters to scholars studying China. And after the postdoc, I returned to my hometown of Hong Kong, and that's where I'm based now. And after joining my university, City U, I tried to come up with ways of incorporating digital humanities learning into pedagogy. So that's also one of the things that I wanted to do, and I'll share a little bit of that with you today as well. So 3 main things or 3 points really that I will try to make today. First of all is in the context of where we are in Asia, and I will draw especially from my own field of Chinese studies and Chinese history to look at the potential of transforming research with digital humanities methods. I will present to you 4 data perspectives, as I would call them, and how they moved, how they impacted the China history field. And the second part is also drawing from relevant examples, but the argument that I will make is that these methods enable an infrastructure that have a translational role. And a translational role meaning the digitization and research allows for an infrastructure that introduces our heritage to not just academia, but also beyond academia with the broader community, with the public. And final point, circling back to how we learn and how we teach as scholars, as teachers, as professors. With the transformations in DH research, our pedagogy also will have to keep up. So that will also have to transform. So first, really I wouldn't claim to be able to cover the whole of Asia. So this is where I'm coming from, the field of Chinese studies in particular, and Chinese history, but of course, bearing in mind the openness of that region and that culture. Of course, it relates to many of the things that we are concerned about. And of course, we are talking about not just one modern nation state, right? We are talking about a civilization that had lots of interactions with other cultures and languages and religions and so on. So, digital humanities as Big Tent. This discussion probably I won't have to dwell too much on to this audience here. This discussion about digital humanities as a big tent covering lots of methodologies, disciplines, fields, that has already been going on for some time. And also there have been critics saying that it doesn't really contribute much to how we forge the way forward. But looking at that initial idea that, as I quote from Svensson, that DH could be and should ideally be discipline-like, network-like, and center-like at the same time. Of course, well, not easy to achieve, but ideally, if that could be the case, it would be really nice. And it would also provide platforms for us to communicate, to interact, to collaborate, and so on. Being as inclusive as we can, being as open as we can to multiple modes of inquiry, multiple disciplines, and so on. But this discussion, as we look back, in terms of fields and discipline, of course, it tries to be inclusive. But in terms of languages and cultures and regions, we also need to strive to be more inclusive. So just looking at the China case here, for the Chinese-speaking world, just the term DH itself already are translated into 3 different ways, depending on which part of the Chinese-speaking world you're looking at. So where I'm from, and in Hong Kong, and in Taiwan, and in PRC, depending on how you translate the digital, already it's 3 disparate ways of phrasing it from the year 2009 onwards, when the paradigm of DH was formally introduced to both Taiwan and also the PRC. These scholarly contexts and debates that arise are, of course, not from a vacuum. They are based on specific social, cultural circumstances. And that's why there also has been this call to globalize the DH, to look beyond merely the West or Latin script data, so on and so forth, to broaden our inquiry, to broaden DH really. So edited volumes, conferences, talks, seminars of the like that deal with the issue of how do we globalize the digital humanities. And of course, it should be more than a slogan, right? We must start with the specific linguistic and cultural and historical, really quite specific nitty-gritty issues in our own fields, especially if we come from a non-Western context. So that's also part of why our work at CityU is trying to broaden and trying to interact with our Asian partners. Our research cluster in digital society has just concluded. So the past 4 years, we have been organizing seminars, putting together projects, finding partners, especially in East Asia, to work on issues pertaining to digital society, which includes, I would say, digital humanities. So it's a group of scholars, of humanists and social scientists mainly. And the past 4 years, we have transformed it into a cluster that will begin to focus on digital learning and digital literacy especially. So from this year onwards, we are going to double down our efforts on digital literacy and learning. And digital society has been one of the interdisciplinary areas that CityU has been trying to promote. Of course, efforts to collaborate, to network, to work together on DH is not confined to my own institution. We see it all across Asia, really, especially in the past several years. So last year at the Graz conference, DH 2023, both the Indian Association and also the Korean Association of DH were inducted into ADHO. And it was also at that event where a bunch of Asian friends and colleagues joined forces to organize this webinar series, DH Asia, especially spearheaded by a friend in Singapore, Sissoko. So it's an ongoing series involving various DH centers in Asia. So the most recent one was organized by us in Hong Kong, but also there are others in Japan, in Singapore, in Taiwan, Korea, and so on. We in Hong Kong, we are also trying to set up an association so that we have a sort of platform for DH work, and we call it HKADH. We're actually going to have our first inaugural conference next January, and we're trying to make it an annual thing. So really what I'm referring to as the Chinese world or the Greater China region or the Chinese-speaking world includes these regions, the PRC, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, plus the scholarly community who work on China. And I guess for many parts of Asia, this is a model that could be applied, right? It's these international collaborations that we often see. It's not just Asia-based scholars, but also overseas experts who work on the region. So for an audience in Thailand, I guess this is easier to explain. The challenges for the kinds of data that we deal with, that we handle for Chinese history. First of all, OCR is already a problem. So for classical Chinese texts, such as the historical biographies that I study and I deal with, the thousands of characters that have to be OCR'd already pose a pretty big challenge. Where accuracy rates of OCR algorithms are improving, but they're still not really there. And that's only speaking for the print sources. For manuscript, handwritten, that's really sort of another level of difficulty, much more challenging even. So for print sources such as the page that I show here, it's a modern critical edition of biographies from Tang China. But still, when being OCR'd, there are a lot of data cleaning to be done. Also, another challenge is even if we have the perfect text digitized, the segmentation of text is also a challenge. So here is a traditional bound printed work from pre-modern China. And as you could see, it's really quite nicely printed. It's legible. The characters are nice. But the red marks are done by the readers. So the punctuation marks, the annotations, so these circles, right? These are the sentence markers, and these annotations are like reading notes. These really are done by the readers instead of the editors or the printers or the publishers. Meaning that even if we have these full texts digitized perfectly, we still need work in word segmentation or even tagging, POS tagging of sorts, part of speech tagging of sorts. So the kinds of text that we see being scanned are often like these. Even if you do not know Chinese, you see it's an ongoing stream of characters, right? And a Chinese word could be one character, it could be two characters, it could be three characters, it could be four characters. So basically, there are no spaces to mark the word boundaries. And that poses the word segmentation challenge, of course. Not only for linguists or computational linguists, but also for us, anyone who are dealing with textual data, anyone who need to work with these sorts of data. So the digitization of these texts go back to late 1970s and 1980s. And these big digitization projects are part of what I study, the prehistory, as I would like to call it, of the Chinese digital humanities. So they go back quite a long time, and they have already become the mainstay, the default mode of many scholars to locate and to find sources for their study. So here you're looking at a 四库全书, like a complete library of 4 branches compiled from the 770s onwards. It's basically the most important compendia of books, of several thousand books in the Qing dynasty. And of course, the customary mode of using these would be keyword searches. So let's say if you're looking at these time periods, the 9th year of the Qianlong reign, the 19th year of the Qianlong reign. So let's say if you're interested in those eras, then you key in those terms and you search and you look through the sources for finding the types of sources that you need for your study. This, of course, transformed the way many humanists study Chinese history. But of course, based on just the challenges that I mentioned, still it's posing barriers to these sorts of research because of the problems in OCR and segmentation. And that is part of how I came into contact with DH. So as I mentioned, I began in text markup. So back in my grad school years, I was tagging 11th and 12th century Chinese notebooks with TEI, text encoding initiative standards, and trying to help my Ph.D. advisor identify flows of information and also interlocutors of information for her project, which later became this book, but also the interactive platform for these sources. So the sources being tagged are turned into a reading platform which visualizes the information flows and also the geographical distribution of the people and places mentioned. And that's how I began, really. That made me interested in these digital modes of handling data and text and asking questions that are sometimes quite different from pre-digital modes of historical inquiry. So now I will go on to show to you 4 of these DH perspectives or data perspectives, as I would like to call them, and how they changed and impacted the Chinese history field. These probably are not new to you. Many of you, I'm sure, are already using these methods with your data and so on. But the point here is to show how this contributed to the infrastructure for my subject of Chinese history. So I'm going to use examples of the digital resources, the databases, and the digital tools that have been developed for these data perspectives. So the first is geospatial analysis, of course, involving historical GIS. And this goes back to the early 1990s at least, with a project called CHGIS, which established the main infrastructure for GIS data for Chinese history. It's a collaboration between Harvard and Fudan University in Shanghai. Social network analysis, very close to what I study, especially with letter writing. So visualizing social network graphs and analyzing them with China biographical database data on social associations. Well, basically the relationships between people. And thirdly, prosopographical and statistical analysis. Again, CBDB data that could be used for this. And fourth, text markup, which no longer is just a manual tagging of text, which I had been doing in my grad school years, but automated markup as well with a tool called Marcus, an online reading platform and tagging platform. So geospatial analysis, like I said, the data that was accumulated really took place from the 1990s onwards, and this project is including both all the possibly identified place names and coordinates throughout Chinese history, and also the time series data for the administrative regions and territories of China. So it's this sort of inquiry and analysis that one could do. So if you look at the sort of map here, it is a mapping of data of the people who gained degrees through taking the civil service examinations. This, of course, was a huge thing for Imperial China. Basically, the elites from medieval China onwards were selected, were recruited through written exams. And looking at their distribution, of course, tells us a lot about the basic formation and structure of the elite, the political and social elite. So these sorts of things have been studied by historians all along, of course, but rarely to the finite nuance that one could have with GIS technologies. So impressionistic views and observations, of course, but tracing the data and presenting them and pinning them down to specific locales and native places and provinces. So let's look at the data here. So of course, the earlier would be the Tang Dynasty, the 7th to the 10th century and the Northern Song dynasty coming the later. And just to sort of let you know that it's also from the Northern Song in which the examination system gained real prominence within the political structures. So if you compare the yellow dots, which focus, of course, in northern China, well, the northern Chinese provinces, reflecting the medieval aristocratic structures. So basically, still the northern families, the powerful aristocrats from northern China dominate the scene, as you could see. But later on, when the examination grew in importance, these were the pink dots. A much more sort of broadening of the power base, the geographical distribution of the power base of the Chinese imperial elites. This, of course, has huge ramifications. Right? It's not just, they come from more places. It's an incorporation of a much bigger territory, of different social practices and customs and regional cultures and so on. This will continue towards late imperial China and so on, and it's defining the nature of imperial Chinese dynasties from the Song onwards. Geographical and geospatial analysis. Of course, with these sorts of data perspectives, we also have to think of their implications and possibly their limitations, right? One perspective is just one worldview, as I usually like to call it. It's one way of looking at an issue through the data. So for geospatial analysis, seeing through this lens, it's of course mapping and visualization, and it of course introduces regional and local perspectives through this sort of mapping, through geospatial ways. And it helps integrating diverse or even disparate data sources. But that's also possibly, a limitation. It's not always easy to do this sort of thing, right? Because the nature of the types of data could be so different, right? It's not always easy to pin down geographically. The same sorts of things we'll have to bear in mind for other data perspectives as well. Each lens comes with its own implications and limitations sometimes. Well, SNA, probably you're no stranger to that as well. With applications such as Pajak and GetFi. Some of the work that we have contributed to, that we are part of at the China Biographical Database, especially when I was part of them, involved marking historical sources. So these historical sources are tomb inscriptions. They're basically biographies for tombs of deceased people. And they are carved onto stone, and of course later transcribed into these huge collections. What our colleagues in the project were doing were tagging these biographies, tagging them for official titles, for kinship relations, and so on. And with these tags, so you're looking at 1, 2, 3, these are either people's names or official titles in the bureaucracy. So these are in red, and the blue, those in blue are official. So those in red refer to people, and those in blue refer to bureaucratic titles. So these were initially manually tagged. Well, it involves a huge amount of work, but later with Marcus, we were able to automate this work. And Of course, with that data, we had about 2,000 texts of this sort. You could visualize them in social networks because the tomb inscriptions mention whom was married to whom. And these were the marriage networks of the powerful in Tang China. Basically huge clusters, as you can see, right? Reflecting that the power base was still quite concentrated in several big clans, big aristocratic clans. And even each of them were connected by marriages as well. So that was how they dominated politics of the time. Social networks is quite core to what I do. I wrote my Ph.D. and I'm working on a book about these sorts of things, letter writing. So letter writing, especially from 10th to late 13th century China, and how their letters form networks. They were ways of networking for these literati officials. So, including for philosophical networks, if you map their letters, you see some of the people who were most important for New Confucianism in 12th century, in 13th century, and so on. So, Zhu Xi, the most important philosopher of the time, and his connections with several other thinkers of the time. And of course, these sorts of inquiry could be shown in various ways, right? If you are interested in Zhu Xi, the person himself, you could set him to be to show his ego network, to use him as the center and look at his connections and so on. This lens, of course, should also incorporate not just print sources, but also letters themselves as calligraphy. So this is a project that I'm currently running, and that is the calligraphy, the preserved handwritten letters, and the metadata that we could see in such letters. So these letters are mostly kept in museums. There are not many, from the Song dynasty. There are about 300 to 400 pieces of this sort of calligraphy. These letters were mostly preserved for their calligraphy, for their handwriting, because they belong to famous cultural figures. And they were bought and sold. Some of them today in auction houses could be sold with millions of dollars. So we're establishing a catalog of these calligraphic letters and trying to map their relations as well. And of course, the number of entries is ongoing. This work is still being done, but we're almost there. Well, it's almost complete. And figuring out the things marked in the digital catalog sometimes could be quite difficult as well, because sometimes you don't know to whom the letter was addressed to. You know the writer, it's usually he's usually a famous person, but you don't know who's the receiver, to whom the letter was addressed. So that requires the sort of detective work of historians, of course. Seeing through this lens, of course, we see an interconnected world. This is almost like a networked lens on the world. We see how people interact. We see how they are connected. We see how they are part of a group, how they form cliques, how they are part of factions, and so on. Network thinking, as some social scientists have used for the study of our world, but not just for the social world. It's also part of many other disciplines nowadays. So it has been argued that the most complex systems, they are almost always interconnected, interlocked. Prosopographical and statistical analysis. The China Biographical Database began as a resource in prosopography. So as some historians has introduced, prosopography is this sort of work. It tries to combine descriptive individual biographical information into quantitative and statistical research by combining these information, and it's inductive. It starts from individual data, and it tries to understand the bigger picture for a society, for an era in history, for a kingdom or for an empire, and so on. And for the Chinese case, this would be what the China Biographical Database is trying to do. So it's these sorts of questions that one could ask. So very basic, right? What's the age of death for the people in the database? It's hard for historians to conjecture, to come up with a conjecture or to guess what's the average age of death for people in history. But if you have collected enough of these entries and data, you could start to be more precise, right? So for, let's say, the 32,000 individuals in which we know the exact years of birth and death, the average death of age is 61, the median is 63. And of course, for the China Biographical Database, we're mostly looking at 7th to 19th century China. This is rather quite high, one could say, right, for a pre-modern time. And there, of course, we could also think of the biases in data, right? We're looking at people whom we know the exact birth years and death years. That's quite rare, right? It's almost always powerful people, the powerful and the rich, and the popular, and the important. So we also see the biases in the historical record. Of course, we could swap things around. We could change the kinds of questions we ask. So if you look at just the women, right? The distribution is quite different. This is just the women within the batch that I just mentioned. The distribution for both male and female is like this, but for just the female, we see 2 humps, right? And of course, this points to the pre-modern mortality for giving birth. So if we look at this age, these were usually deaths due to giving birth. So at that age, it was a high risk for this part of history in China. And so discrepancies in gender and so on for these data. So again, seeing through these lenses, we could identify the common features of a big group. We could also try to compare. This requires piecing together a lot of biographical information. But the kinds of information criteria could sometimes be restrictive as well, because we are coming up with a schema. We have fields that we fill in, and sometimes the historical source just doesn't cooperate in that kind of way. Right? It's not easy to extrapolate always these fields from the sources. The fourth data perspective is text markup and analysis, which is easy to understand, but more importantly, I wanted to show you part of the infrastructure for this sort of work for Chinese texts, and that is the Marcus platform. If you're interested, you could go on the URL. It's accessible, it's free. Anyone could upload a text in Chinese or Korean for markup. For tagging in an automated way or manually, or marking up keywords that you define, especially the dates and the place names and the people's names and the official titles and so on. These, of course, are bringing together data from the CBDB and also other resources such as the Dharma Drum Buddhist authority database and keywords in Buddhist studies. There could be more as the infrastructure is being built. These sorts of collaboration are being forged. So just to quickly show you what kind of functionality it has, the people's names, the time periods, the place names being tagged, so it aids your reading and aids your note-taking, but it also helps with visualizing the text. It shows you, oh, if you are looking for this place name, Yuzhang, where is that? It mentions this place name, oh, it's actually in current day Nanchang in Jiangxi province in China. So on and so forth. Not just for place names, but also for people's names. Oh, that person here, I don't know who that is. So conveniently looked up through here. And of course, these texts are also readily available online now, such as the Chinese Text Project for Chinese philosophical texts, but I'm sure for Thai, for other languages, for other Asian texts, there are such text repositories as well that could be used for this sort of work. Seeing through this lens or data perspective, these sort of platforms make it more streamlined when we read and when we take notes of the texts and the sources that we study. It also makes it more shareable. We could share these marked up texts with collaborators, with students, with other scholars. And it also encourages the sort of inquiry that goes beyond just the full text keyword search that I've alluded to when I was beginning to speak. It's almost like a platformization of our text data that we study. So there are increasingly more platforms like these being developed. At least in the Chinese world, that is what I see. There are already several leading platforms that are being developed in Taiwan, in mainland China, and so on. So 4 DH or data perspectives on Chinese history. With these, I want to go on to talk about infrastructure building and its role in translating our digitization and research for not just academia, but also the public, introducing the public to these sorts of work. And this is, of course, based on the understanding that this is all part of a cyber infrastructure, or DH infrastructure, as some would call it. The cyber infrastructure is the research environment, right? And of course, the research environment brings together, well, multiple institutions, multiple applications and data sources and tools and so on. So we often go back to the ACLS report, the American Council of Learned Societies report on cyber infrastructure. And it mentions that it's not just the tangible, right? Of course, that is already implied. We bring together different pockets of data or different applications. We make them compatible. We make them communicating between each. But it's also the best practices and the people and the ways of communicating and working together and collaborating. And to be honest, this is often more challenging than the tangible. Well, at least for us in the China field, that's what we observe. That's what we see, that the state of the work is actually more challenging than the technical or the tangible part. So ideally, an infrastructure should help us access different sources of data. It should be communicatable, it should be compatible, and it should have different degrees, right? Because we also need to know what we could share and what we don't want to share. And also link it up with tools that could be used for these sorts of data sets and resources. So in a paper that I have written with some of my former colleagues at CBDB, we argue that it's basically two main questions here. It's about resource sharing, but it's also about, well, the intangible, which is about communication. So for CBDB, I've already mentioned quite a bit. The challenge is to digitize biographies. All the biographical information from Chinese history we want to digitize. Of course, this is a long ongoing project. It's also quite hard to finish, right? It's an end goal that cannot be achieved anytime soon. But it's also a worthy goal. It's a worthy objective. Because modern technologies really now help us with this sort of challenge. It's something that no historian could read through. No research project could deal with alone. But with digital technologies, we now have the means. It is in a collaboration that is established between Harvard and Peking University and also Academia Sinica. So during lunch, I was just mentioning to Professor Song Pan and Cassidy that this is really quite uncommon, right? And it's really quite a valuable collaboration between the U.S. and PRC and Taiwan. It's nowadays, of course, it's even rare. So now it contains 640,000 historical figures and counting. Of course, it's still ongoing. And these are the types of data that it collects. Well, basically, all the entries we try to populate with all these fields. But of course, again, the historical source doesn't just cooperate with your goal. They don't always contain these exact data. So part of the challenge is also for the humanities scholar to figure out, when did that person die? Does it mention anywhere in the source? If not, how could we do some guesswork? How could we make an educated guess, and how could we document those sorts of reasoning, so on and so forth. So for CBDB, there had already been an API developed by the CBDB colleagues for sharing. And we argue in that paper that sharing is so important and it should also be done in ways that are clearly communicated. So for CBDB, it's an API, it's an application programming interface in which it's well defined, and users, if users are pulling data from CBDB, they should also be able to specify and define what they need and in what formats they would need to make that request. So if you search for on the CBDB website, if you look at the API, it's under the download tab. You could see how you could call up the CBDB data through an API. This, of course, came a long way. The project originated in the 1980s, so long before 2005, really. It began as the data of one social and economic historian at UPenn, and that was his data then bequeathed to Harvard University, and which became a large-scale project. First, manually digitizing books like these. These are biographical dictionaries that are compiled by elder historians. So manually, typing, input, proofreading. I'm sure some of you, developing digital projects have gone through that stage. At least I have done quite a bit of that work myself as well. But later on, with more digitally sophisticated methods as well. So when I was with them, we took part in the Digging into Data Challenge, especially spearheaded by the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US. And back then, we were mining 2,000 local gazetteers for biographies. So it was to extract Chinese biographies from 2,000 texts and trying to come up with algorithms that we could use to extract them in batches. We also had other projects back then, such as focusing on specific dynastic periods and so on. But also, like I said, communication is so important. So from 2016 onwards, the group also focused quite a bit on that, on talking to other projects, on developing infrastructures, on propagating what we think are good practices in sharing and communication and so on. And from 2018 onwards, the database was also working with a online education group to develop tools for commercialization and for educational purposes as well. So one example of these sorts of infrastructure building efforts would be from text to tagging platforms, or from biographical data to the sorts of information that you could pull up on these platforms. Without any of these, with the collaboration of these projects, it would not have been possible. If you were just trying to, as one group, as one project, do this sort of work, it's a lot harder. So that was really one of the lessons that we learned when we were developing this sort of infrastructure, including, well, for GIS data, which I already mentioned, for these map layers and for place names, also having APIs for sharing and for defining the formats for sharing this sort of data. And also, some part of the challenge is educational, or it's for changing mindsets. to tell other projects, to talk to them, and to establish the common ground that sharing is necessary, that sharing is not stealing, right? And that there are well-defined procedures or levels of authority for that sort of sharing. Some data could be shared, some needs to be embargoed, some is just private or copyrighted or restricted. There are various technical solutions for that, but it also involves the changing of mindset. If we are just closing up and sealing off our data, none of this is possible. This is especially because researchers are facing more complex needs in terms of data. We're not just reading through the data, just locating the source through a full text search. We need to mine them as well. We need to conduct statistical analysis on them as well, so on and so forth. Also, the sharing of documents or the setting of repositories, which I don't have time to go into the details, but that also has been a movement within our sorts of communities of DH scholars, right? So if for Harvard, that of course would involve the Dataverse project and so on. And for other universities and institutions, other kinds are available. For the China field, these tools developed into various platforms and ways of sharing and infrastructural tools, such as for OCR algorithms on CText, for tagging and visualizing data or mapping data, such as Marcus, which I have shown briefly, and also for Taiwan's DocuSky, or for cataloging across library collections, not just for one collection, but cross-catalog search and sharing of titles and bibliographic data, and also for other kinds of data, for studying various topics, such as the bureaucratic titles in imperial dynasties, as I've mentioned. Those sorts of lists, or in some other sort of ways of phrasing them, those authority files or ontologies could also be searched and should. So such as those code tables in CBDB or the Dharma Drum Authority Database Project, which is an authority database for place names, people's names, book titles, and so on for Buddhist studies. And communication, right, is actually sort of more challenging or more critical in some aspects. So we propose things like these. Online portals for communication, such as websites that update automatically by crawling or drawing data from projects, or communication, sometimes old school ways. The humanist discussion group is still going strong. Actually, they could be quite effective in some ways. Or for newer ways, social network accounts. For the Chinese speaking world, it's on WeChat. So we have several groups of 900 and more people, of scholars and grad students and project managers, quite active talking about issues, sharing about events, or even just making friends, networking, and so on. These are also part of infrastructure, as I would argue. So already partnerships are being built. such as with education companies or with netizens. Sometimes we don't even know who they are. These are just users building tools, but they're building tools that are really quite creative and really nice for using the CBDB data. And in this case, these are online interfaces for generating heat maps for GIS visualizations or for network graphs and so on. I still don't know who this person is, but it's on this blog and it's documented on this blog. A very, very creative use of the data. All this is to show you one example from CBDB how infrastructure could be built. But I also need to show and explain how infrastructure could be used, right? And so the example that I would like to use for that second purpose is with Silk Road projects, especially based on Dunhuang. And this is to, again, to say that DH is translational. If there are translational sciences for the natural sciences, the humanities also have translational needs. How do we harness DH digitization and research work for introducing our heritage, not just to scholars, but also to the public? So let's use Dunhuang and the Silk Road as examples. I'm not sure how much I need to explain the Silk Road, but of course it's an important part of Eurasian overland cultural exchanges. So the Chinese scholar Ji Xianlin has said that Dunhuang was really quite unique in that the four cultural systems met and they interacted and they intersect. So the ancient civilizations of China, India, Greece, and Islamic civilization, and so on. And of course, there was a lot of trade, there was a lot of cultural exchanges, religious exchanges, especially of Buddhist iconography, Buddhist sutras that were deposited in these caves of Dunhuang and along other sites along the Silk Road. So magnificent murals and manuscripts in such caves. These, of course, require the expertise of philologists, historians, religious experts, art historians, so on and so forth. And that's why we see projects such as the IDP, International Dunhuang Project. As some of you might know, the Dunhuang library cave, the texts in them are all scattered in various libraries of the world. They are in many, many countries already, from the 1900s onwards. Of course, gathering them is almost close to impossible. It's a huge diplomatic and political sort of negotiation and headache. But gathering them digitally is possible. So that's what the IDP was doing, based at the British Library. They have manuscripts such as these, important, Diamond Sutra, right? One of the most important texts in the Buddhist tradition. And also not just for Buddhist history, but also for the history of books, of Chinese texts, and so on. But not just for manuscripts. I mentioned, the murals, the paintings in the caves. The preservation of them are also very, very urgent and important. Of course, it's nice to go and visit as a tourist, but that could not go on for many, many years if it's always exposed to erosion, weathering, and moisture. So there's also the Chinese project of Digital Dunhuang, in which these murals were preserved, and also panoramic digitization are done, such as this one. So now, if you go on Yi Dunhuang, you could actually use and see the 3D panoramic images. These we use in our teaching as well because it's great. We don't always get the chance to take our students to the sites. So with these and with VR, it's nice to be able to show these to our students, such as the Jataka tales and how these circumambulation rituals could be done. The library cave, in which many of the manuscripts of the IDP project were originally found. These are not just for scholars alike. They could be turned into exhibitions for the public. So, although it's not always easy, to take a long trip to Dunhuang, but the digital artifacts could travel. They have been shown in many, many exhibitions for the public, for educating, for appreciation. So such as in LA at Getty, such as in Hong Kong a lot of the time. If it lets me flip the page. Maybe it's out of batteries. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Okay, or that's okay. But I could go on, and including in other exhibitions in Hong Kong, and of course, it's ongoing, this sharing of the heritage and spreading of the digitized, oops, okay, not so fast, yeah, we're getting there. This I went to because it's actually very close to home. It's in Hong Kong, in the district where I live actually. So recreating the settings of the caves and showing the digitally preserved 3D projections and more ongoing. This is just really quite recent at the Cam Lab at Harvard. They just had a cultural week focusing on Dunhuang. Other projects of the like are also are there, such as those headed by Japanese institutions, the Digital Silk Road Project. I won't have time to go into the details, but these are all quite important databases and data resources as well for the Silk Road. Finally, coming to an end, and I will keep this brief. Really, this is to make a final point that the infrastructures that I have talked about is not just for digitization and research and so on. These DH transformations require transformations in learning and pedagogy as well. We are plotting the future of humanities learning with DH. And of course, the talk of the town is often the ChatGPT, AI chatbots, and so on. At my institution, I'm a huge promoter of the incorporation of chatbots in text-based humanities education. I think there's just no other way forward. We will have to embrace the AI wave. Even if we are not, our students are already. They are using chatbots. We could either police and ban them, or we could guide and learn with them. And that's also the idea that digital humanities, why are we calling it that term, right? We have, of course, this query always. And in my view, the digital label is just transitory. It's just transitional. It's just temporary. Do we have to emphasize the humanities are digital in, let's say, several decades' time? Probably not. So when we guide our students, when we teach, of course we show that, well, language models are not knowledge models yet. These LLMs that they're using do not necessarily immediately reflect the knowledge that is there. Of course, it's also not general AI, strong AI. That's also what we still have to preach, I guess. But we as digital humanists, we need to close the gap, right? We need to help the digital databases and resources and tools to be more friendly to LLMs that are being used. And of course, the students and our colleagues also have to achieve this sort of complementarity. So I won't have time to go into details, but I am running a small project about incorporating AI chatbots into history, learning, and pedagogy. All the text-based humanities will face this wave. It is already facing this wave, and we are adapting. We need to adapt. There are tasks that really no longer work as effectively, but there are, of course, tasks and assignments and assessments that help students learn and learn with chatbots. We don't always have to go back to, okay, let's cut off the Wi-Fi. Let's give you a pencil and pen and paper and give you an exam, right? But along the way, information literacy, AI literacy is so important. UNESCO has an AI literacy framework. Information literacy education is of utmost importance. So these activities that one could use for letting students learn with AI and not just scaring them away from these tools. They won't be scared. They are using them. At the same time, reminding them that immersive learning experiences are so valuable, such as continuing the Silk Road theme. Some of my students made me really, really proud because they made these podcasts as storytelling exercises. Of course, they could use AI, right? They could generate scripts, they could write stories with AI. But it's not just the creation of those texts. It's also how they reenact, how they make them turn into real life. Stories of, well, these are stories of women along the Silk Road. So reimagined by my students and reenacted, performed on podcasts through audio means. So coming to an end, really, reiterating the 3 points I would like to make. First, just the examples that I use from my own, rather small and confined field of Chinese history, especially pre-modern China, DH transformations are already driving a lot of the change in the field. And the second point is the changes also underpin the translational potential that we introduce these heritage to the public, not only for the scholarly community. And the third is that humanities learning and pedagogy need to adapt and catch up. They will have to transform as well. And we as digital humanists have to be part of that. We probably have to lead that sort of change as well. And without further ado, just finally, this is some of the recommendations and references that drove my points today. The URL is a folder of some of the writings that we have published about some of the ideas that I've presented today. So feel free to download and critique and comment and contact me. So some of the references here. And I look forward to your questions and thoughts and comments. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that you found Dr. Tsui's presentation very thought-provoking and enlightening as me. It helps us to see that digital humanities is a place of inclusivity. Also, we gain more knowledge, we fill the gaps of knowledge, and also it's a place of collaboration and strengthen our education as well. So now I'd like to open the floor of questions. Anyone want to raise your hand and ask the question for Dr. Tsui? Okay, let me start first. Yes, you mentioned that digital humanities can help to fill the gaps of knowledge and for the scholar, for research. But also you talk about public education, and I'd like to know more how you educate the public and translate the very scholarly content into to catch their attention.
Well, let me just give one example that come up with from the back of my head, and that is we actually face a big demand in Hong Kong, especially when we tell our colleagues and friends that we do digital humanities. We face a big demand, especially from schools, from school teachers. So from, let's say, middle school, high school teachers, they are really feeling the need to make the humanities relevant for their students. And so that's why I've been doing these workshops for discussing with school teachers on how to use some of these tools, such as markers, such as CBDB, to incorporate into their teaching and their guidance of their students. This really, is like a basic version of what we teach in universities and so on. But already we are seeing, the fruits of that sort of learning and development of infrastructures in the public, the so-called public. And of course, this involves sometimes training the trainer. And of course, we are also learning ourselves the challenges that our teacher colleagues are facing, or what their students are asking for. So, for instance, when I was conducting a workshop for some of our school teachers in Hong Kong, they also face the AI wave, right? So I was coming up strategies with them on how teachers could also use the chatbots to design better exam questions, better exercises, such as multiple choice questions. I as a teacher, I always hated designing multiple choice questions, but with AI chatbots, it's becoming a nicer task for us, and it's also becoming a more fine-grained and strategic learning task that we do. So I think one of the ways really is to train those who train and teach those who teach, and it seeps into the public eventually, as I would hope. Thank you.
Thank you. That's amazing. Any more questions?
Please,
Yes.
shy. Yes.
So I'm Songpan. So I have a question, especially coming from your background in Chinese history. And I think in Thailand, we also have people in Thai history. And there are some sort of, how could I say it? Sort of the dichotomy between traditional and becoming a digital. And I think I would like, we probably have heard a lot, or there are a lot of literatures on discourse from the Western side about, you are sort of, digital historian, and I am a traditional historian.
Yeah.
And with that in the context of Chinese, do you have any experience in terms of how do you share, or how the traditional people, like traditional approach people, or digital historians, are meeting with the, traditional one, and then do you have ever come up with the discussions, or would that augmented, or any further knowledge or anything that happen?
Many discussions, really. So from the mid 2010s, for the China field, I think digital methods really are going mainstream, and I try to track this, especially how digital humanities research make their way into the top journals. Of course, in the really cutthroat competitives of academia, this would be the main indicator. And for the Chinese history field, it's in roughly 2017, 2018, when all the top journals are starting to feature digital methods and digital humanities outputs. That's of course a good sign, but that doesn't mean we are all embracing, or we are still dichotomizing, as you mentioned. And as for dichotomizing, I have a personal sort of feeling that I think the digitally oriented scholars also have to maintain their old and traditional hats, if we could call it that. Of course, that's also not nice to call it that way, but I have been going to history conferences in which some of my friends and colleagues say, "Oh, haven't you gone digital? You're still coming back to our traditional history conferences." And I think that's a way to push back a little bit, that they coexist, and not all of the DH work are merely digital. So bridging, and also talking to the so-called mainstream, or the more senior scholars and the more traditionally minded, and communicating how we are just another way, right? And that goes back to my point in which DH, the D, right, the digital, is really just transitional. We're making a point, but that point probably doesn't have to be made I hope not that long of a time. And we are, of course, using another medium. We are using sources that are somewhat different. We're using methodologies that sometimes could require some training. But this has happened in the past. I am a historian, so I know for sure, right? If we look at book history, print, there has been so much doubt and question surrounding the rise of print and the use of print and so on. But of course, it's there to stay, just like our digital technologies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm told that we run out of time here. So on behalf of all of us here, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Tsui for sharing his expertise and vision with us. And once again, let's show our appreciation for Dr. Tsui Lee Kang with a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So thank you Professor Hang for your inspiring talk เซี่ยเซี่ยหนินและในโอกาสนี้นะคะก็ขอเรียนเชิญรองศาสตราจารย์ดร.ทรงพันธ์เจิมประโยงมอบของที่ระลึกและถ่ายภาพค่ะ